Welcome to HR Voices, a podcast for independent HR and people professionals and the businesses they support. HR Voices is brought to you by the expert team at HR Independence Limited. We hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another fantastic episode of the HR Voices podcast. I am Mary Asante, your host, and with me here is my co-host Charlotte Allfrey and Kevin Poulter from Freeths LLP. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us today.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. What more could I be doing on a sunny afternoon in London? There's nothing else I can do or where I'd rather be.
I'm pretty sure you are a very busy person. I know that. So we really appreciative of you kind of sparing some time and coming to join us today. So we've been having conversations around flexible working, very interesting perspectives from various hosts that we've had on the show. And today, with your legal background, and we'll give you a minute to introduce yourself, your role, so that for the purposes of those listening to us today, they would know who you are. But we thought we'll get a legal perspective on the whole hot topic of flexible working with you, if that's okay.
Of course, hot topic. I think one of many at the moment.
Excellent. So Kevin, tell us, well, we know who you are, but for the purposes of our listeners, tell us a bit about yourself, and also for everyone tuning in today, we, as in HRI, partner with Freeths. So Freeths is our legal partner. So we run lots of webinars, events, etc. And they also help us with our help desk. So our members with our help desk queries as well. So yes, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. Look, well, gosh, nobody wants to hear about me. And if they don't know who I am already, shame on them. But generally, so I'm an employment partner here at the London office, actually, of Freeths. And gosh, I've been doing the job for a long time now, over 20 years, more than 20 years, a lot more than 20 years, actually. And look, we've seen some changes over that time. Some things have stayed the same. Some things have changed, I'm pleased to say, for the better. I think between us, we've probably heard and seen most things. So I do general employment work, working with you guys, working with your clients, with our clients, working often, mostly, in fact, for employers, but occasionally for employees as well, particularly those sort of in the senior levels of employment. And I think it's nice to see sometimes things from both sides. And I think that adds actually a benefit to the work that we do, and probably similar for you as well, that having that rounded view, I think most times employers always try and do the right thing. And very rarely have I come across an employer who, for the sheer bloody mindedness of it, has actually wanted to cause people problems. Very rarely does that happen. It does happen occasionally, but I think we are seen there to sort of guide employers in the right direction, give them the options, but also give them some solutions, hopefully, as and when they need them from us. And flexible working is one of those which, like you say, has been a hot topic. We've been dealing with this more and more over the last few years, particularly since the pandemic. And I know we'll be touching on that a little more, so I won't jump ahead too soon.
Great, thank you very much. So let's start by talking about flexible working in itself. It does mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
From your point of view, what is flexible working?
Oh, from my point of view, well, I'll go from a legal point of view From my point of view, it's flexible working means it does mean different things to different people, and what they expect from it can be different things as well, which is one of the critical requirements, is to actually understand what people mean by it if you're going through this process. So from a legal point of view, at least, flexible working can mean about changing sort of more flexible hours, varying the hours of work, varying the days of work, and increasingly varying the place of work, whether it's having to go to the normal place, that's usually the place where you're contracted to work from as an employee, or whether it's working remotely, whether that's from home, whether that's from your holiday home in the Caribbean, or whether that's working sort of in a coffee shop somewhere, or indeed even another office or workplace location that belongs to the organization. So it can mean different things to different people, but nearly always it means a change from the norm. And I think that's the key part.
I mean, I think after the pandemic, I don't think any of us really know what the norm is anymore, because it's opened up the discussion so much, hasn't it? It's absolutely catapulted the discussion around flexible working sort of forward years, actually.
Yes. Well, yes and no. I think that's, and we'll touch on some of the reasons later, but I think the pandemic gave people an opportunity to see how things could work, because there was no alternative but to make things work. Prior to the pandemic, I think it was unusual for employers to be actively open and welcoming to flexible working as a matter of course. I think the pandemic has shown employers more often than not how flexible working can work for the organization, and doesn't necessarily automatically mean less work, less productivity, less availability, which is as being a negative. I think properly planned, properly considered flexible working actually can revolutionize both a business, but also the way that employees respond to that business and how motivated they are and engaged with that business. So it's not everyone. The real issue with flexible working is, not every organization is the same and has the same way of approaching it, and for good reasons. Not every job is the same and can be approached in the same way. And although it shouldn't make any great deal of difference under the rules, so the reasons why people want to have flexible working, I think also can change person to person, of course. So there's a lot going on, but I think certainly it's become a lot more available. I think more time is now given to properly considering flexible working requests rather than just the automatic, we don't do that here, which has happened in the past. I think now this sort of new way of working, which we've all experienced since 2020, the question is this here to stay, or are we going to go back in time, back to how it was? And I think we'll be talking a bit about that as well.
Yeah. I think you are absolutely right in that there is no one size fits all approach to it at all. Each case needs to be dealt with on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
And then, yes, the interesting thing is most employers before the pandemic almost had a default answer of, yeah, we've considered, but no, we can't accommodate because you were employed in this type of role, be it around the working hours, the location, pattern, etc. Everything was, this is your employment, this is your contract, and no, I'm sorry, but we can't accommodate that. But the pandemic kind of taught us that with a bit of consideration, adaptation, technology, and support, a lot of roles can accommodate a degree of flexibility within it.
I think what we've also got now, though, is a very big defence to putting in a flexible working request, because whereas before businesses would say, no, that's not how we operate, employers and employees are now saying, but we've been doing it for 3 years, so why not?
Absolutely. And when an employee does approach an employer about this, the answer shouldn't be, and of course the rules are, the answer shouldn't be no. The answer should be yes, unless there's a reason. It shouldn't be an automatic response, and it shouldn't be really the responsibility of the employee to say, although there's a legal requirement to say how you think it can work and what exactly you're looking for. The response from the employer should be to listen to that and to give fair reasons why it can't work, not to look for reasons why it can't work. And it's that shift in balance and approach to it. And I'd love to say things have changed. I don't think they have. And I think actually there's a real risk that we are going to go a little bit backwards. The old excuse that I used to hear more than anything else was the IT. We can't get the IT to work remotely. That was nearly everyone I was dealing with. And for most employers, so 5-10 years ago, it was, we can't, from a data protection point of view, from a licensing point of view, from a sort of monitoring workstation, but anything you could think of to make it not work was the reason for it not working. Yeah. And then all of a sudden overnight, suddenly everyone can work remotely. It was a big shift. The reasons why people are no longer as open to that, I think, has also come as a consequence of the pandemic. And it's the big issue is, and the big word for us all to keep thinking about, is about trust. Ultimately, the reason is we don't want you to work remotely because we can't see you and we don't trust you. That's the hurdle to get over. We do when we've got no alternative but to trust you. But if we have an option over it, that's the reason. So, and trust, by the way, for people listening, is not one of the fair reasons for refusing any flexible working requests.
If we look at the beginning of the employment life cycle, so let's go right to the beginning, recruitment. Before you think about bringing someone on board as an employer, what are some of the considerations that you need to take into account from a legal aspect in terms of recruitment, flexible working? Can someone you are interviewing say, actually, are you open to me working this pattern or not? And are you, as an employer, able to say, actually, because you said that, I don't want to give you this job?
I think it's worth going one step even further back than that, which is about sort of job adverts and recruiting from the very start. And rather than having an expectation that everybody has to work a full-time week on fixed hours, if you can work flexibly, then make that known, that we invite applicants looking to do a job share. We invite applicants who are who wish to work remotely or flexibly in some way. If it works for the business. But the automatic assumption shouldn't always be, this doesn't work for the business. So I think having that thought process at the very start, looking at the specific role that's required and identifying opportunities where people can work in a slightly different way, actually it's going to probably open the doors up to a whole new sort of group of people who might not otherwise have even applied for that job. And we know what the job market's like at the moment. It's hugely competitive. It's expensive to recruit people, and increasingly so. If you can get a wider net, a wider pool of people, more people to look at, more diversity in all senses of the word, then why is that not a good thing? And actually, most employers say that's what we are doing. But in reality, we shut it down immediately by saying this is a full-time job. So thinking about it at that early stage. And then this is always a difficult one to answer. What happens if somebody sees that job advert that says full-time work? They know they don't want to work full-time, but they know they've got maybe responsibilities 1 day a week, 2 days a week that they can't get away from. They either don't apply for the job and accept that's not a job for them, or they apply for the job and then try and work through that conversation that, is this something that could work on a more flexible basis? And then we hit a whole potential mess of what's the reality now. If somebody does raise that themselves in an interview, what's then the reason for possibly rejecting that candidate? Is it because of that request? And if it is because of the request, what's the reason for that request? Is it because I've got caring responsibilities for a child, for somebody who's elderly, for somebody who's sick, because I've got my own perhaps disability or other sickness or other reasons to be absent? Employers can't go delving into that, but they can make an assumption based on the reasons that they are assuming there's that flexible working request, and why, or not necessarily flexible working request, but something other than what's been advertised request. And I think that's a really big risk to a business. Now, that's not to say that some jobs are full-time jobs. It's not to say that some jobs you can do remotely or do it in another flexible way. I've had something recently, I won't go into details, obviously, just in case clients are listening, but if somebody's applied for a full-time role and then suddenly partway through the process says, actually, I can only do part-time, it leaves an immediate bad taste, regardless of the reasons, with that employer. Well, why have you applied for the job if now we've offered it to you, you say you can only do it 3 days a week? Why? There's almost that, again, it's trust. It's also about honesty. And we all know at the moment, and we will talk about this more, but at the moment, you don't have a right to request flexible working, let alone a right to flexible working the first 26 weeks of employment. Beforehand, counts like you've got no right at all to even request it. So that's what people need to bear in mind. But employers very reasonably and quite rightly can say, we can't accommodate that, we won't accommodate that, because at the moment they have no right to request it. But always be warned and always be aware of whether there's any either tacit or actual knowledge of what the reason for the request for flexible working might be. And if it is related to something which is a protected characteristic or associated to a protected characteristic, it comes with a bit of a risk as well.
Yes, and you touched on it, so we must as well talk about it now. Whilst at the moment, people cannot request until 26 weeks before they qualify to request for flexible working, it's a changing landscape, isn't it?
It is. And we should be very careful to say at the moment, the law hasn't changed. It still is 26 weeks, but the government's published its response now to the consultation that it did, which seems to have gone on forever, around the right to request flexible working. And there is an intention, almost a promise, if that counts for anything anymore with the government, but there's a promise there to say that we will make it a day one right to request flexible working. And there's various other changes as well. For example, I'll just sort of summarize these as we go through. So A, it's a day one right. B, there's a requirement on an employer to consult with the employee if considering rejecting it, in order to really look at alternatives. At the moment, that doesn't exist. There's no obligation on the employer to do that. You can only make a flexible working request once every 12 months at the moment. They're going to extend it out to, very generously, twice every 12 months. So once every 6 months, you can make a new request, and circumstances do change. As we know, a business might refuse it on one ground, but those grounds change over time. And then just to close the loop on that, that the period which an employer has to respond to that flexible working request will reduce from 3 months is at the moment, which is a hell of a long time, down to 2 months, which is still a long time to consider it, to review it, to go through the whole process of accepting it or rejecting it and giving the reasons. It will remove the requirement for employers to specify in a flexible working request how the employer might deal with the effects of that request. So it's putting the responsibility back onto the employer to look at ways of making this work, rather than the burden onto the employee to say, this is how it can work, and these are the ways around any issues that might arise. So it's essentially opening the doors to make things a bit easier. Whether that actually comes into a reality is yet to be seen, but certainly the intention here is quite clear, that flexible working should be a fair consideration, and it should be done wherever possible in the interests of the employee.
It seems a real shame, though, doesn't it, that actually we jeopardize the trust in a recruitment relationship or an application relationship right from the word go. Because, and I've seen actually more recently quite a few ads going back to the point about, are we going to go backwards? Quite a few ads now saying on site, and some are saying, we'll consider flexibility. And that's a really good thing, because it sets the expectations right from the word go and doesn't end up with that immediate mistrust thing. I mean, I've been through that exact scenario. We've taken someone through to sort of second interview, really good candidate, and then they've said, can't do 5 days, can only do 3. Yeah. And the client's been devastated.
Yeah. And however, and there's probably, we don't know this yet, but there's a big but, which is, who's going to be brave enough on day 1, on day 15, even after 26 weeks, who's going to be brave enough to stand up and say, look, you've given me the job, but now I want to put in a flexible working request, whilst they're either under probation period, perhaps, where, as we know, there are pretty much any reasons you can give for sort of terminating that employment relationship. There are exceptions, of course. That's for another podcast another day. But in probation periods, very short notice, any reason almost goes. And even within that 2-year period, you're still not safe unless it's for a clear discrimination reason or some other limited reasons. People can be dismissed without any real threat, any real risk to the employer, including if they don't like the fact that you've made a flexible working request. That won't be the reason on the paper or necessarily to the face, but that could be the underlying reason. So I think my expectation is that not a lot actually will change, even with this change in the law, at least for a while, until some of these processes are tested. And we'll see what the tribunals say about how strong these rights are and how much an employer should be doing, what's reasonable, what's unreasonable in accepting or dealing with these requests.
I think you're absolutely right with the exceptions element of it, because I do work quite closely with technology companies. And when you're working with specialists, I think employers are a lot more accommodating of requests, etc. Because if you're struggling to recruit talent into your pool, then you will be a lot more flexible yourself into meeting the demands of the people that you are taking on board. Whilst in non-specialist roles, probably the employers may have a bit more leverage in terms of deciding, actually, no. And like you're saying, less than 2 years of service, no protected characteristics, probationary period, 1 week's notice or whatever, and come up with.
But we all know how easy it is to actually, give different reasons, find reasons. That's where the tribunals really have to step up and to take a more robust approach to it. But and obviously for employees as well to actually test the boundaries of this and to test their employers by taking them to tribunal, which we know can be hugely expensive, hugely time consuming, and not always give you the outcome that you want.
So the next bit that I would like to explore is various aspects of flexible working. So the 4-day working week has been talked about quite a lot. And I think there's been a research on it as well. And that shows that the companies that were involved in the trials, I think as high as about 96% of them are looking at continuing at their own, voluntarily on it without being forced to do anything about it. So again, looking through the legal lens, what are some of the pitfalls and some of the things that you need to be mindful of as an employer if you are thinking about implementing a 4-day working week?
That's a really good question. And it fits exactly into flexible working generally and some of the pitfalls that arise through that. I think it's all too easy to think, like we started talking about, what does flexible working mean? What does a 4-day week actually mean? And for some businesses, it means different things. Some businesses, it means that the whole business shuts down for 3 days when people aren't working. Others, it means that there's a sort of a rolling cycle so that always there's sort of cover, if you like, whether it's a customer-led organization or client-led organization, there has to be somebody to answer the phone or to deal with queries, just to do the job. So is it a rolling 4-day week? Is it a fixed 4-day week? Is it something which is flexible even within itself? But what's important to know about most, I think, 4-day weeks is that it's not 5 days consolidated into 4 days. That's a very different thing. It's 4 genuine, normal days of work, not squashing all those hours into 4 days. And I think that is a real mental shift for a lot of employers. Hang on a minute, what? We're still going to pay people the same. We're still going to give them the holidays. But they're still going to do the same amount of work. Hang on a minute. And they're not going to do any extra. How can that possibly compute? And there's always a bit of a fear as well that people who enjoy doing 4-day weeks, they think, well, for the last however many years, people have been dossing around on a Friday or for part of the week because they've managed to make it work. And 96%, I think it is, as you say, have made it work. How's that been possible? And I think it's down to a lot of things. And correct me now, guys, if I'm wrong on this, but same amount, if not increased productivity, fewer sick days. Yeah. And I think something crazy like 2/3 less or fewer sick days, 2/3, like clearly. And of course, the goodwill, the well-being, possibly it has an impact on recruitment and at the other end, people leaving. If you don't have people leaving, you don't need to do as much recruitment. It keeps people moving in the same direction. So all of these things together do show you how it can work. And in the same way that whilst people were absent from workplaces during COVID, it didn't mean they stopped working. Actually, many people worked harder and longer than they did when they were coming to the office. This is, I think, proof of that in many respects. Now, it doesn't work for everyone. It can't work for everyone. And if you are working in a particular way, like, for example, we sometimes have a question about this with our own firm. Like, can lawyers work on a 4-day week? And of course we can work on a 4-day week, but it means shifting the mindset. Yeah. It means if somebody's not available, making sure that somebody else is available. And it's a bit of an organizational shift. Not to say it's impossible, it just needs a little bit different, a different way of thinking about it, a different way of approaching it. And I say I'm heartened, not for my own selfish personal reasons, that people have made this work, because fantastic. The downside at the moment, of course, is if you've got 3-day weekends, the way the economy is, what are you going to do? Stay at home and not do anything? You can't eat out. You can't go to the theatre. What can you do? You can't afford to do anything. But this is a real dilemma. And I think it may even, and I don't have any evidence about this, maybe you do, I think it might even keep people working for longer. Yeah. They may think, well, do you know, I'm going to put off my retirement because I can spend an extra day a week doing one of my hobbies. I can do the fishing, I can play the golf, I can go to my cross stitch class, whatever it could be. They've got something else to do other than just work. They may put off their retirement a little bit longer. And I think it's not always a good thing, but I think for most employers, they want to retain their staff. So I think it's I can see opportunities for where it will work. I can see issues where it won't work. But like so many businesses already work in a similar way on a shift rotation. Essentially, that can be akin to a 4-day week. It doesn't mean doing more in less time, always. It means doing what you were doing, but managing it in a different way.
Yeah.
Go on, Charlotte.
Well, I was going to say, I think I think the assumption is that if you're going to go to a 4-day week, it's 4 compressed days.
Yeah.
And that you're still going to get 100% salary and you're still a full-time worker. But actually, if you are a business that is genuinely engaged in well-being and looking after people, a 4-day compressed week is not very beneficial for anybody either. Because I certainly wouldn't want to do 4 long days. And yes, you would end up with that 5th day off, but you're going to be shattered, aren't you? And it just doesn't feel the right arrangement. It's hard. It's even harder to accommodate probably childcare, caring responsibilities, whatever else you need to do within a long day.
Yeah, absolutely it can be. And if you've got that day off, then you might be exhausted and sleep through it because you've done so much other way. Now, the other thing that's possibly worth mentioning is the challenge. We talked about consolidated hours, and I think that people who do work flexibly, people who do work reduced hours, nearly everyone that you speak to says, I end up doing more hours than what I'm actually paid to do. And I think the same rules probably apply to the 4-day working week, that there's always going to be that expectation or anticipation or even that obligation to do those extra hours when they need to be done. Now, how does that differ? It doesn't differ to how I work now, certainly, how a lot of people work. Most of people's contracts say you'll do these hours and any other hours sort of reasonably required to make sure you get your job done. What an employer would have to do, I think, in that 4-day working week is to try and more proactively manage that, because otherwise, what's the point? If people are still going to work 5 days, but we're going to call it 4 days, it's kind of missing the point. And say how you manage that, how you deal with inevitably the employee disputes that might arise by somebody saying, well, and I've seen this again in practice, that somebody works a 4-day week, and gets paid 80%. This is under the current flexible working regime. They work a 4-day week, they get paid 80%. Somebody else works a 4-day week on consolidated hours and gets 100% of pay and everything else. Now, those two people might end up doing the same amount of work over the course of a week, because the person doing 4 days and getting paid 80% ends up doing more work than they are paid to do, essentially. How does an employer manage that? And that's a real difficult dilemma to deal with, which brings us back around to dealing with flexible working requests as they are presented to you, but taking, arguably, the employer taking a more proactive sort of approach to monitoring that in some way. No obligation on them to do it. There's no legal requirement for them to do it, but otherwise it could result in these employee disputes internally with, well, they're doing this, they're doing that, and Muggins here is getting paid less for doing the same thing.
I think that's definitely an argument about employers being more pragmatic about their approach to flexible working, especially 4-day working week, taking into account the employees' well-being, their productivity, accountability, etc. Because you don't want to run your workforce into the ground, while everyone gets to a burnout stage before you start doing something about it, and taking a more pragmatic approach and giving your employees the confidence that yes, you can work 4 days and to give the output that's expected of you. And if it's the occasional going above and beyond the hours that they're expected to do, that is a slightly different story. But if it's a constant state of flux of working 70 odd hours when you're contracted to do 40 or 37 hours, then there are serious issues there, I would say, that employers need to review, consider, and sort of really make it work for them and their workforce as well.
And I think there is a fear and an anxiety from employees who are working under flexible arrangements to speak up and say, actually, I'm doing more hours than I should be doing. It isn't working for me, because the whole purpose of this is for it to work for them to start with. They don't want to have the flexibility taken away from them, but they also recognize that they're doing more than they should be doing. And that is a real dilemma. And I'm going to jump in with something that you might have on your list already, but let's talk about it now, which is sort of sex discrimination. Yeah. Because inevitably, well, I say inevitably, I think it's a fact that more women will be working on flexible arrangements than men. And I think that there's an expectation that women, as we know actually, about, hang on, I wrote this down somewhere, I've got my name for it somewhere, but the childcare disparity, that's what I was looking for. There's a recognition that women will have more childcare responsibilities, caring responsibilities generally, whether that's sort of younger people or older people. That has to be taken into account and will be taken into account by a court. But actually, men also lose out somewhere along here. That there's an expectation that women will be taking time off to do good things with their time, and they will be automatically pushed to the top of the queue in considering flexible working requests. And actually, that's to the direct disadvantage of men. And it's worth pointing out that when you're making a flexible working request as an employee, you don't even need to give a reason why you want to work flexibly. It could be to do, I don't know, the golf or the fishing or the cross stitch again. You don't have to give that reason. You're under no obligation to give that reason. And it shouldn't be taken into account when the employer is considering what the reasons, whether they can accommodate that request or not. Whereas I think women, in the most cases, it will be automatically assumed that it's for a good reason. Or I say good, what's deemed to be a more valid reason, and one which people are more and more scared about discriminating against.
And actually, very important points that you've raised there, that there are sort of discrimination potentially against both men and women. So flexible working touches everyone in the workforce. It's not a women's issue or it's not a men's issue, but it really touches everybody within the workforce. And actually directly linked to that, last year within the employment law world, there was lots of excitement because of the ruling in the Harper versus Brazil case, where sort of there was this whole thing around part-time workers or people working flexibly, let's say prorated, are entitled to 5.6 weeks, which is the full-time equivalent of anyone sort of who works full-time. And a lot of employers and HR people, and I'm sure employment lawyers, are scratching their head. Now, what do I do with my term-time workers? What do I do with people who only work 2 weeks a whole year for me because they are doing something else or that's what they want to do, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it has been a bit of a head scratcher. And it's a really difficult concept, even for us hardened employment lawyers. It's a really difficult concept, like a logic to explain it and to reason. But you're right, employers particularly have been a bit thrown by this. Methods are being put into place already to look at how we address it, how we deal with it. And we have to remember, in reality, this affects so very few people. But because of certainly in employment circles, the headlines that it created, it has put a bit of a fear into people. And that again could work against those who might otherwise be more open-minded to things. So I think it's one of those things which is going to be a bit of a storm in the teacup if we look at it back in 5 years' time, I hope. and I hope we're not still talking about it. Please, I hope we're not talking about it in 5 years' time. But absolutely an important point to make. And the point, like, it's a really good point you make about term time working generally. And various issues have come up in response, partially in response to this, partially just in response to term time working generally, where how that impacts on people's holidays. And people with children, childcare responsibilities, they're limited on when they can go on holiday. And if people are working term time contracts, it has an automatic impact on those people who are not working term time contracts, but when they can take holiday, to cover off absences generally, ones which are legitimate, perhaps ones which are not quite as legitimate, sickness absences on top, other reasons, it can be a real, again, administrative problem for employers to deal with. So thinking it through whether term time requests should or shouldn't be allowed is not just about what's happening immediately, but also what's happening during those holidays, what might be the consequence of that, and actually taking the time to work it through in a reasonable, but also sensible way, but not making that knee-jerk response, which is automatically, no, thank you very much.
Yeah, great stuff. And I'd like to sort of move us on quite quickly to look around working patterns generally, because again, with the pandemic came most people working remotely. And then post-pandemic, some people have moved to hybrid type working where they go into the office for a couple of days and they may work remotely for the other aspects of it and vice versa. And there are some roles that have gone fully remote, but there are some employers also yearning to bring their workforce back into the office full time. So it's thrown some really interesting challenges around working patterns generally. And so if we can explore that a bit.
There's a lot to unpick. And I think with a lot of these things, it's about going back to basics. Sometimes, and you've probably heard these things as well, sometimes I say, well, look, we're paying for this very expensive office space, and it's just not occupied as much as it should be. Well, the question is, what comes first, so the office or the people?
The money, and the money as
well. But why are we spending money on an expensive office if people are working remotely? And it's a vicious circle. It's a catch-22. We need to encourage people to come into work, but if they aren't coming into work, how do we encourage them? And if they happen to be at home, what's the reason for them coming in? And if you remember, people, we're going to put on a breakfast in the office to tempt people back in, and we're going to do a drinks thing of an evening, and we're going to put on a lunch here, and then we're going to do teamwork on this day, and we're going to do something else. All of these incentives to try and encourage people back to work. And mostly they've not worked. The people who came in still came in. The people who didn't come in still don't come in. For most people, a bacon butty, it's not going to attract the vegetarians for a start, and it's not as big an incentive when you're spending £10 or £15 perhaps to commute, and then you got to look after your lunch. The incentive's not there. So what is the reason? I think coming back to, are we bringing people in just for the sake of justifying an expensive office? Are we actually bringing people in because we do think it's a genuine requirement of their job to work in this? And the word we've heard more than anything else is collaboration, in a collaborative space, to be able to collaborate with your colleagues. Is that a genuine thing? Did people speak to each other before the pandemic? And if they didn't, why should they speak to each other now? What's the reason? So don't think about these things just for the sake of this is how it's always been done. We've got a chance to reset. We've got a chance to go back to basics. And I think more often than not, it's for HR managers, for people, directors, or whoever else it might be, those people who are sat around the board table, to actually speak up and talk about these things, and not just rely on, well, this is what we did before, this is what we need to get back to, but to stand up and say, why? What is the reason for it? Because if we're not talking about those things now, you can guarantee that people will start making those flexible working requests. We will have this administrative burden of having to deal with them, of having to justify things. And it does, although it's the law, there's an element of it does seem almost a little bit unfair that this is just first come, first served, which it is. If you're the first one to put your flexible working request in, and you get that 4-day week or 3-day week, and you want that Friday off, the next person that comes along won't get it. Like, no matter what their reasons are, it just can't work for them, perhaps. So I think having that chance, having that conversation, talking to people, getting that employee engagement back up and running, and actually thinking, what is working for us? Are we filling an office because we've got an empty office? Or are we filling an office because we need to get people together for these reasons? It actually works the other way as well, of course, that a lot of businesses have shrunk their office space, the number of work spaces, and they can't actually accommodate the full workforce during the week. We need people to work flexibly. We need people not to come into work. So it does work both ways, but there has to be this give and this take. And I think it's right, absolutely the right thing to do, to encourage people to come into work if that's good, if that's what's required, but not to force it necessarily just for the sake of doing it, just for the sake of filling up an office on a Monday or a Friday. The other thing that's worth talking about, perhaps, is just the disparity that's arising between sort of the us and them, of the people who can work flexibly and those people who can't. And when I say flexibly, I usually mean remotely in this situation, that if you're working on a checkout down at a supermarket, you don't have the option of doing that from home. But the people back in the head office do. And there is increasingly the us and them of how communications are made around how people do work, and the perceived, not always the actual, but the perceived benefits of working one way or another. And often it does come down to, why should I spend my money, and I have seen this, why should I spend my money coming into work when other people can work from home? And I've actually seen employees making expenses claims for commuting, for lunch. If I was at home, I wouldn't have to pay for lunch. You're telling me I've got to come to work, I want you to pay for my lunch now, and sending in the prep bill. So these things are actually coming up, and there is this big risk of having this sort of this two-tier system in remote working, and flexibility as well, to a point.
I think that's why it's absolutely clear to have the expectations. So I think that's where you need to set out your policy, your approach. I mean, one of our other guests talked about trialing the 4-day week and it being incredibly successful, but not without its challenges. And it's taken them a while to get the model right. But the biggest thing for them was absolutely a leadership mindset change, because if the leaders aren't leading the way, then the creep does sort of set in with people doing more hours than they should, or still working on the 5th day, or doing lots of other things, or putting requests in for their mileage or their lunch and things like that. So that's, I think, where setting policies and boundaries and opening the conversation is really beneficial.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It is very much leader-led, and some leaders, the people sat at the top of the tree, some of them found that actually during the pandemic it worked really well for them, and those are the people are now, or should still be, the advocates, the ambassadors for this new way of working. But I think it's also, and again, I'm saying this with an element of, I've got nothing to back it up, but my gut feeling is, just from what I know and what I hear and what I see, is that all those dads that were relishing, putting on LinkedIn how much they were enjoying taking the kids to school in the morning and picking them up of an evening, suddenly they're back in the office full time. They're not picking the kids up and dropping the kids off. That's back on mum, or that's back on somebody else. And I think it seems to have very quickly gone back to how it was, particularly in the sort of the whether it's the sort of the primary care or whatever it might be, but typically straight down sort of gender lines, that there seems to be more people coming back in to the office who were, at one point, they couldn't stop talking about how much they enjoyed not being in the office. I find that very interesting, and a bit of a surprise how quickly that's happened.
Yeah, I think that you raised some really interesting points there. So whether sort of it is when you're in a temporary state, you're only doing it for a short time and you love and enjoy doing it, but actually given the option, there are probably some people who would go, actually, I'll quite happily go into the office, because there is also that element of, once you've gone, you've logged out and you're commuting back home, at least you've left work. Whilst if you're working remotely, you kind of work, get on with life, and then back to work, because you're like, I need to finish this, I need to get this done, and I need to get that done before today is over. So you're not quite just logging off and finishing for the day. Your day merges into one.
Yeah.
And then
it's true. And just speaking again from experience, that the people who are coming into the office most are typically the people at the junior end of their careers. They're starting out, and whether it's because they've got a fantastic appetite for learning and for being with people, or whether it's because a lot of them might live in shared houses, coming to the office is actually a bit of a break. It's getting away from maybe your one bedroom or the four walls that you're otherwise in. It's probably no coincidence that it's the more senior people that tend to come into the office less, for, again, possibly very good reasons. But I think that, again, it's back down to that leadership. It's back down to making sure that everybody's supported. There's always that opportunity around for people to properly engage, to collaborate, to be supervised, to be available. And we can make it work online. We know we can make it work online. It's not always the best thing. And I think we have to acknowledge that as well. And it will come down to what people are now putting into their contracts at the very start of their employment, and how we expect people to work, and whether that's a contractual obligation or whether that's just this is what we prefer to do. It's a guidance rather than a rule.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about the contract aspect of things, there's also that element of what is written down in your contract versus your culture. So what actually happens on a day-to-day basis. And if it all goes pear-shaped, what prevails is not necessarily what is written down.
Absolutely right. And I say it feels to me that there's so much competition out there at the moment for employees, for staff, that most employers probably want to do as good a job as they can within some parameters to keep staff happy, to keep people happy. There are ways of doing that. I think that you're right. What's written down and what the culture is can be two different things. And that works in both directions, for better and for worse. But I think having that sort of that top-down approach, ideally having leaders who and decision makers who've had some experience of this, who can say, do you know what? It is a good thing to have some time off, to have a flexible working arrangement, to have, whether it's consolidated hours, whether it's reduced hours, whether it's the ability to work on a hybrid basis or work remotely. I can see how that worked for me, and therefore I want to encourage other people to make it work for them as well. But it's that personal experience. And I think that's why it often is along gender lines historically, because men haven't necessarily always had that experience or that opportunity. So I say I'm hopeful that the pandemic won't quickly be forgotten about, and the changes that we made there. My gut feeling is that it very quickly we're going to be moving back away from it and backwards in time, unless people are ambassadors for the 4-day week, ambassadors and advocates for flexible working at the very top of the tree, and allowing people to show them how it works. Yeah, and successfully.
Great stuff. I know there's a bit that Charlotte is quite passionate to explore. So we'll quite sort of touch on that. And then, so over to you, Charlotte.
So, I mean, I think whilst it all sounds very logical, very sensible, very collaborative, that it works and it's good for productivity and all those great things. But ultimately, I just think, actually, I'm going to be the advocate for those employers out there that just feel it doesn't work for them. And having worked with some clients where they're potentially asking people to come back 1 day a week or 2 days a week, and having real kickback and pushback, and them sort of really having to say, well, where do we go from here? Because we do want to turn these down because we don't think we're being unreasonable. I just think I want to be the voice for those people because I want to hear what they can do.
Well, look, Mary's already said it. The starting point is going to be the contract. What does the contract say? And although you recognise that we have deviated for reasons that aren't necessarily our cause over the last few years, the starting point is, look, you're required to work full-time hours in this particular location. The risk to that, of course, is that people vote with their feet and you end up with no staff. A lot of the banks now in the city, I think, are pushing towards back in the office, I think at least 4 days a week, some of them even 5 days a week. I know, Mary, there are other examples of this all around in every sector, probably, that there's this sort of this requirement. And I think that there is some, of course, there's some middle ground. Of course, there's a way of making this work that keeps as many people happy as possible. And maybe this is one of those situations where, look, this is what the rule is now. It has to be led from the top again, like all these other things. There's no point in saying to people, you have to be in 4 days a week if it's the bosses that are the ones that are coming in 1 day or 2 days a week. It has to be sort of evidenced and shown and represented from the top down. But I think you have to also take people with you on this. What's the reason? Give them a reason to come in. Give them what's the explanation? Not just because we've got some expensive office to fill, like I said before. There's got to be some sort of reason for doing it. And if there is no reason for doing it, then expect to get flexible working requests, which you're going to find very difficult to turn down. And if you do turn them down, they're going to be turned down probably on reasons which can't be justified. And you could then end up with, well, potentially, ultimately claims on the back of it, or no staff, one way or another. So I think it's back to basics, like I said. Why do you want people in 5 days a week? What's the reason for it? And actually, is it a reason which we can evidence, we can justify and support? And if it's not, actually show yourself to be more liberal about this, so more forward thinking about it, and say, well, look, we know that people don't necessarily want to come in 5 days a week, but we want to come to a situation which works for everybody. And this is what we're going to propose. So there's ways about doing it, but employee engagement here, I think, is the buzz phrase. If you're going to do something, take the people with you. Don't leave them behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Kevin, for your time. And if we can end it on a positive note as to your tips for employers who are seriously considering flexible working for their workforce, whether it's the hybrid, remote, or whatever, and some sort of assurance that legally you are no more at risk of litigation as you would be if your staff were with you in the office 5 days a week, for example.
Yeah, now that's not to say that there aren't difficulties to get over, and even doing the workplace assessments remotely is something that we need to be thinking about. People talk about, again, the costs of paying for desks and chairs and other things, for computers for people to work at. But there are ways of working around all of these things. And I think the reality is that whilst there is a shortage of employees, whilst there is a cost of living crisis, people aren't going to really choose to leave willingly unless they've got a better offer. I think making your employment with you being something which is actually good for everybody is a good place to be. I think flexible working is something that we can use as a tool in that sort of arsenal of other weapons to make us a good place to work. And actually, what ultimately happens, and again, I've seen this, is that if you're a good employer, if you work well around these things, then you will not only retain talent, but you also attract it as well, because good news actually does spread as fast as bad news. And the last thing you want to have is people saying bad things about you. If you've got people saying, look, do you know what, they were really good to me, and that actually becomes, well, in itself, endemic. It creates good feeling, it creates good vibes. And if you're, I know it's an old phrase, but if your employees are happy, the productivity does go up. Everybody's happy. Staff are happy, customers are happy, clients are happy. There's lots of disclaimers with this. Don't come back and sue me when it doesn't work out. But I think flexible working is here to stay. The government's keen to make it work, as evidenced by the changes to the law. The 4-day week might be one of these things which just gathers more and more pace as it rolls out. I think the incentive for the trial was a good one, but where does it go from here? Does it stay there? And actually, if anything, this will be employee-led. There will suddenly be this push for, why aren't we doing this? And you can end up with the whole workforce putting in the flexible working requests at some point. Who knows? And then you've got a whole sort of class action to deal with on the back of it. But let's avoid those things. We'll stay on a positive. It can work. We've seen it work. But also, if it doesn't work for you, there are legitimate, lawful and fair reasons for saying no.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, once again for tuning in. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions or follow-up with regards to this specific episode or any other episode, or if there are topics that you'd like to hear us talking about, please do get in touch. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of HR Voices. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover or would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media or email us at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. Tune in next time.